part of what drives the insane green woke agenda is the claim that, and Nature, this once great science magazine, one of the world's top 2 science journals, just published an article this week, Scientists for Degrowth. So what's degrowth? Well, here's the proposition. There's no way the planet can sustain the number of people it has on it at anywhere near the level of prosperity that those privileged to be in the West have managed in the last 30 years, let's say. And so, those of us in the West, except for consultants, are going to have to tighten their belts and, suck that gut in a few notches. Now, that'll mean that people in the developing world can put the bloody belt around their neck and tighten it until it's the noose that kills them, but it doesn't really matter because there's too many people on the planet anyways. And so this degrowth philosophy that's driving Canadians into penury, especially poor Canadians, isn't a bug, it's a feature. It's driven by this agenda that assumes that we're yeast in a petri dish and that we'll keep on multiplying insanely and parasitically until there's so many children on the planet that, every animal is going to go extinct. And we better put limits to growth on as fast as possible. Stop doing things like flying around the world or owning private automobiles or heating our houses in the winter, which they're having a hell of a time doing in the UK at the moment. It's like you can just forget about all that. And so it isn't only that we're going to be poor, it's that we bloody well better be poor because it's a moral crime to be otherwise. The whole damn planet's at stake, which is an absolutely preposterous pack of lies that's so corrupt that it's almost incomprehensible. It's so fun too, because you get all these incompetent government policies produced, say, by our Prime Minister, who isn't really interested in monetary policy. Yeah, they can say that again. And so the failures on the economic front can be justified morally. It's like, well, yeah, the economy is collapsing, but it has to collapse because if it kept growing, we would just threaten the planet. And here's what strikes me as particularly horrifying about this. See, imagine that the woke environmentalist utopian types had their metrics right. Just for the sake of argument, imagine that they were right about carbon, and they're not, but let's just say they are. And let's imagine that their goal is actually to produce a greener and healthier and more biologically sustainable planet, and they had their metrics in place. Well, that'd be fine. That'd be fine, at least in principle. But the truth of the matter is that by following this insane utopian green woke agenda, Germany, for example, has managed to make its electricity 5 times as expensive as it used to be, and they've now fallen to like 167th in the world in terms of the amount of pollution produced per unit of energy. So all that wind power, which actually doesn't work very well when the wind isn't blowing, like it hasn't been for the last 3 weeks during this cold snap that's enveloped Europe, it's just meant there's more coal plants than there were in Germany when they started this whole bloody green revolution. And so here's what's going to happen if we don't get our act together, and we probably won't, but if we don't, we're going to make everyone poor, and we're going to destroy the bloody planet while doing so. And I would say, in my darker moments, I think that's the plan, because there's an antithetical sentiment in relationship to human beings at the bottom of this woke nonsense that's so goddamn deep and perverse that it's positively genocidal in its aim. And you might think, well, hold on there, Dr. Peterson. It's like, yeah, how many times has someone said to you, yeah, but the planet has too many people on it anyways? You have to, first of all, that isn't a person saying that, okay? I'm dead serious about this. That is not a person who's saying that to you. That person is the unwitting or witting mouthpiece of a system of unbelievably pathological and destructive ideas. And those ideas do not have your best interests in mind. So,
Jordan, in my own view, which I've often stated, is that who wins the hearts and minds of the, to use Mr. Nixon's phrase, the silent majority of decent, sensible people? Because they're still there, no matter how deserved they are. Who wins?
Well, I've been working with a group of people in the UK, and we'll announce this sooner or later, and probably sooner rather than later, on trying to formulate an alternative vision. Anyways, we've been trying to formulate something that you might regard as a counter vision, and I can tell you some of the policies that we're pursuing, just so you know, and we'll make this broadly public sooner or later. So the first is on the energy front. It's like, you want to help the poor? Then make energy cheap. Period. You don't get to sacrifice the actual poor to the delusional poor of your delusional utopia 100 years from now. We did that a couple of times in the 20th century. Didn't work out very well. And so you can produce all the bloody renewables you want, and more power to you, but you can do that within the confines of a free market system, and you can do that by making them cost competitive, or you can get the hell out of the way. And so you might say, well, what's the alternative? Well, the alternative, and we already know this, is extremely expensive and unreliable energy sources that are at least equally as damaging to the ecosphere, and that certainly are expensive enough to drive the vast majority of people who are barely clinging to the edge of economic viability into abject poverty. And so enough of that. There's nothing you can say on that front that's moral. If your goal is to drive up energy prices, you're not going to save the planet, and you're going to kill maybe millions of people. If you really got your act together, you could probably kill hundreds of millions. I think the World Bank has already estimated that we've tapped something like 150 million people into near starvation conditions. And we could really get moving on that front if we keep mucking about. So the next thing to do, if we really want to be stupid, is to knock liquid natural gas availability in Europe off kilter badly enough, and maybe Putin will give us a hand with this, so that we can no longer produce ammonia fertilizer, because ammonia fertilizer feeds 4 billion people, and it's derived from natural gas. So that's policy one. Cheap energy. We can ameliorate absolute poverty with cheap energy, right, throughout the world. We have no right whatsoever in the colonial West to tell people in the developing world that they shouldn't be aspiring to standards of living like ours, to be able to heat their houses without choking on the fumes, to provide their children with rudimentary access to educational opportunities. We have no right whatsoever to say, you guys, you just stick with your bloody dung and your wood. You don't get liquid natural gas or coal or any of the things that we use to elevate ourselves out of freezing in the dark. So that's policy one. Policy two is something approximating a multifactorial environmental vision. It's like, why did we all decide in a fit of stupidity the only thing we had to worry about on the environmental front was an excess of carbon? It's like we're going to take a multifactorial problem, because there are environmental problems, and we're going to reduce it to one thing. I don't know how many of you know this. Maybe you could clap again. Do you know, how many of you know, let's do this. How many of you think the world has less vegetation in it than it did 15 years ago? How many of you think that? Come on, admit it. Okay, so how many of you know that the planet is actually 15% greener than it was in the year 2000? Oh, you do? Okay. How many of you know that that's a direct consequence of carbon dioxide production? Okay. How many of you know, this is what's really comical, how many of you know that most of that greening has occurred in the semi-arid areas that were supposed to turn into desert? Yeah, right. So, we could, very funny. Yeah, right. Fossil future with Alex Epstein, yeah. So we could produce an intelligent environmental policy that would be something like, well, we need to develop a vision that takes the necessity for human economic development into account and makes it primary, So the goal would be more for everyone, including our children, in a way that is as efficient and clean, whatever that means, as possible. That's fine. There are sophisticated people working on such visions. Bjorn Lomborg's a great one. I like Alec Epstein a lot. Michael Schellenberger is reliable. Marian Tupy, the Cato Institute, he knows what he's talking about. These are people who have a vision of a planet where there's more than enough for everyone, and that's within our grasp. That is definitely within our grasp. If we wanted that, we could obliterate, we're already doing a pretty good job on that front, as it turns out, but we could obliterate absolute poverty for sure in 15 years. And we also know, and this is so cool, and one of the things that shocked me when I first started to look into this, so imagine you do want a more sustainable planet. Okay, fair enough. Do you want poor people on that planet, or do you want rich people on the planet? Well, it turns out if you can get people's income up to $5,000 per year on a GDP basis, they immediately start taking a long-term view. Well, why? Well, how about because they're not scrabbling around in the dirt trying to figure out where the hell lunch is coming from, right? They can start thinking about the beauty of the local environment and the possibility that something attractive could be maintained for their children and grandchildren who are likely to live to see it. And so there's a very strong positive correlation between environmental sensitivity and wealth. So I found that out about 10 years ago. I thought, well, doesn't that mean we could have our cake and eat it too? We could work diligently to ameliorate absolute poverty around the world by driving energy costs down to as close to zero as possible. We could make everyone rich in terms of their local standards of living and the opportunities they have for their kids, and we could make the planet better off. Well, why wouldn't you want that? And the answer is, the planet has too many people on it anyways. And so, I can't overstretch how deadly the anti-humanism at the bottom of that sentiment truly is. It's pathological beyond comprehension. So, there's two more. I'll go over them very quickly. This is the toughest pill to swallow, but perhaps not for those of you in the audience. I spent a lot of time in Hungary recently, and I know that's all fascists and Nazis, but I met with the president of Hungary, who I liked very much, Katalin Novaks, and she was one of the spearheaders of the Hungarian family policy, and they spend 6% of their GDP on family support. And not in a socialist way, let's say. So how do you do that? Well, here's what they do in Hungary. If you're a married woman in Hungary and you have a child, you are now exempt from 25% of state income tax for the rest of your life. 50% with 2 kids, 75% with 3, and with 4 kids, you never pay a cent of income tax again in the rest of your life. And so, yeah, so I thought, well, that's cool. The feminists must be celebrating that like mad all across Western Europe. And of course, their response is, you're just trying to turn women into baby-making machines. It's like, hey, I thought what you guys wanted for the last 300 years was for a society to become sophisticated enough to monetize the disproportionate female contribution to reproduction. That's kind of like the core dream of the genuine feminist. It truly is, right? Because you could say, I mean, with some degree of accuracy, that women bear a disproportionate cost for reproduction. What is a woman? A woman is the sex that bears the disproportionate cost for reproduction. And that's even biologically true. It's biologically true. And so this is a lovely solution. And so the Hungarians have, with their family support policies, which are much more extensive than that which I just laid out, they've cut the abortion rate by 40% in 10 years. It's still legal, and they did it without compulsion. So that's, unless you're the sort of person to get your sister an abortion as a Christmas present, you might think that that's actually a very positive move forward, right? Because who the hell thinks that's a good thing? You might think it should be legal and you might think it should be available, but there's really something wrong with you if you think it's good. And so to cut it by 38%, which is what they've done. That's quite the stellar accomplishment. They've also simultaneously increased female work participation by 13%. So not only have they freed women from the onerous burden of excess taxation, but they've increased the number of women who are participating in the labor force. It's like, what the hell's wrong with that? So one of the policies we're going to put forward is unabashed support, and I think the psychological literature bears me out on this. We know perfectly well that the minimum viable domestic unit for the nurturing of healthy children is a man and a woman. Now, maybe 2 adults could substitute for that, conceivably, but when you bring it down to 1, you're pushing your damn luck. It's too complicated to raise children. You can't do it optimally with 1 person. Some people struggle mightily and sort of manage it, but it's not an ideal and it's not optimal. And fatherlessness, I'll tell you a couple of things about fatherlessness. If you're a 12-year-old boy and you don't have a father, the telomeres on the end of your chromosomes are already 10 to 12% shorter. That means you will already die sooner, because telomere length is one of the things that predicts lifespan. And so we don't know why. It probably has something to do with some poorly understood relationship between chronic stress and chromosomal health. No one knows why. If you're a female and you don't have a father, you hit puberty at least 1 year earlier. And nobody knows why that is either. And that's not good, right? You don't want your 8-year-old hitting puberty. She's not ready for it. And the probability that that's the case is much higher if she doesn't have a father in the house. And we know that fatherlessness is associated with a catastrophic cavalcade of developmental problems. And so it's time for conservatives and centrist liberal types to say, look, we got to be tolerant. Every family that you've ever met has its problems. Nobody lives up to the ideal of long-term, faithful, loving, peaceful, productive, generous, heterosexual monogamy. Like, it's an impossible ideal, right? You're going to fight with your wife even if you stay with her, and you're not always going to be happy, that's for sure. And probably you have divorced people in your family, you know. Maybe there's a gay guy or 2 in the woodpile, who knows? And so we need to tolerate the fringes, let's say, because we're all imperfect, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't celebrate the ideal. And we got to stop being like half-witted and cowardly about this and do it forthrightly. So